In 2023, in the climate-controlled archives of a university in Atlanta, a historian named Dr. Margaret Chen discovered something that would unravel 151 years of deliberate silence. It was a single portrait, daguerreotype and hand-tinted, showing 12 children arranged in 3 rows before a painted backdrop of pastoral English countryside, a cruel irony for children born into bondage in rural Georgia. The photograph bore a handwritten notation on the reverse: Wright Plantation, July 1851. Children of the household. The discovery happened almost by accident. Margaret had been conducting research on plantation photography for more than a decade, examining how visual documentation could reveal truths that written records deliberately obscured. She was cataloguing a collection of photographs donated to the university by an estate in 1987, boxes of images that had been gathering dust in university storage, rarely consulted, relegated to the margins of academic interest. Most of the photographs were unremarkable: landscapes, formal family portraits, architectural studies, but this one image stopped her completely. The children's faces told a story the photographer likely never intended. Their skin tones ranged from pale to deep brown. Their features carried the unmistakable markers of mixed heritage, yet they were formally dressed in the finest clothing available in that era. Starched white collars on the boys, ribboned dresses on the girls, polished leather boots on every foot. The smallest child, a girl who could not have been more than 4 years old, clutched a porcelain doll. Behind them, her hand resting on the shoulder of the eldest boy in a gesture that conveyed both authority and something that might have been tenderness, stood a white woman in her early 30s. Her expression was frozen in something between duty and resignation, as though she was performing a role she had been assigned to play. Her name, inscribed in faded ink below the frame in careful Victorian script, was Eleanor Hartwick Wright. Margaret's hands trembled as she examined the photograph more closely. She knew the Wright family. She had encountered them multiple times in her research on Georgia plantations. Thomas Wright was a figure of considerable historical documentation: letters, business records, accounts in contemporary newspapers and journals. But Eleanor Hartwick Wright appeared in those records as a peripheral figure, if she appeared at all. What Margaret found in the official documentation was consistent and deliberate. Eleanor was listed in every formal record as barren, a tragedy that had become the subject of whispered sympathy in the county's social circles. Marriage records showed that Thomas had married Eleanor in 1869, when he was 53 years old, and she was 16. His first wife had died in childbirth, leaving him with no surviving heirs, a catastrophe for a man of his standing and ambitions. But according to every official document in Georgia, birth certificates, marriage licenses, plantation ledgers meticulously maintained by Thomas's overseers, wills, probate records, church documents. Eleanor had produced no children. The plantation records listed her as barren with a consistency that struck Margaret as almost obsessive. It was as though the documentation itself was engaged in a kind of deliberate reinforcement, as though someone had wanted to ensure that no one, reading these records in future generations, could possibly doubt that Eleanor Hartwick Wright had never given birth. Yet here, in this single photograph, was evidence that contradicted the entire historical record. 12 children, arranged formally, dressed expensively, standing with Eleanor, their arms sometimes linked with hers, their faces bearing unmistakable resemblances to her own features. Margaret set the photograph down on the archival table and took several minutes to compose herself. She had been trained to maintain scholarly objectivity, to approach historical evidence with skepticism and careful methodology. But she also possessed what all good historians possess: an intuition for when something is fundamentally wrong, when the official narrative has been constructed to conceal rather than to illuminate. She examined the photograph again, this time with a magnifying glass. The image quality, while faded with age, was remarkably clear. The photographer had been skilled. The composition was professional. This was not a casual snapshot. This was a formal portrait, the kind that would have been expensive, the kind that would have been commissioned deliberately and with clear intention. Someone had arranged for this photograph to be taken, had dressed these children carefully, had positioned them with Eleanor. Someone had wanted this image to exist. But according to the historical record, this image should not have been possible. Margaret removed the photograph from its protective sleeve and examined the back of the frame. Pinned there with a small brass fastener was a second photograph, considerably smaller and severely damaged by time and moisture. The image was grainy, barely legible, but Margaret could make out the figure of a young black woman, photographed in profile. Even through the damage, the resemblance was startling. The woman had Eleanor's exact jawline, Eleanor's distinctive nose, Eleanor's high cheekbones. Below this damaged photograph, in handwriting that differed from the inscription on the frame, was a single phrase written in faded pencil, the truth she could not speak. Margaret's breath caught. She had been doing this work long enough to understand what she was holding. This was evidence. This was testimony. This was someone's desperate attempt to preserve a truth that the official record was systematically erasing. She photographed both images with her digital camera, then carefully returned the photographs to their protective sleeves. She made notes in her research journal, documenting the exact location of the photograph in the archives, its catalogue number, its provenance. Then she began to search through the donation records, trying to trace where this image had come from, who had preserved it, who had decided that it was important enough to pass down through the decades. Before continuing, subscribe and turn on notifications. Here we unearth secrets buried by official history and give voice to what was silenced. That discovery, made on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon in September 2023, would take Margaret on a 7-year investigation that would challenge everything the county's historical societies had recorded, everything the State Historical Commission had documented, everything that generations of historians had accepted as established fact. It would expose a silence so profound, so methodically maintained through institutional power and social complicity, that entire families had forgotten they carried its weight. The descendants of the children in the photograph, scattered across the country, many of them unaware that they were the products of a history that had been deliberately erased. Chapter 2. The Machinery of Erasure. To understand how Eleanor's story disappeared so completely, one must first understand the Wright plantation itself and the broader context of how the plantation south functioned as a system designed not merely to exploit labor, but to control narrative, documentation, and memory itself. Located in an isolated county in the interior of Georgia, approximately 40 miles from any town of significant size, the plantation sprawled across 200 acres of cotton fields, red clay roads, and structures ranging from the main house to the slave quarters to the various outbuildings necessary for agricultural production. By 1869, when Eleanor arrived as a bride, the plantation was already in the process of recovering from the devastation of Reconstruction, adapting to a new economic system while desperately trying to preserve the social hierarchies that had characterized the antebellum South. Thomas Wright was a man of considerable influence and cunning. He had survived the Civil War with his land largely intact, a feat that most historians agree required both ruthlessness and a willingness to cooperate with Union occupation forces in ways that many of his neighbors found shameful. Thomas had managed to negotiate with the occupying Union officers, had provided information and resources that benefited the occupation, and had emerged from the war with his property largely untouched, while neighboring plantations were seized or devastated. This survival, while ensuring his financial security, had also marked him in the eyes of his peers as someone who had compromised with the enemy, who had chosen pragmatism over honor. There was something in Thomas that seemed determined to restore his standing through other means. When his first wife died in 1868, leaving him childless at age 52, the loss was compounded by a sense of failure. A man of his standing should have produced heirs. The failure to do so was viewed in the society of the time as almost shameful, as evidence of some deficiency, either physical or moral. When Thomas married Eleanor in 1869, the decision was widely understood as an attempt to correct this failure. Eleanor's family, the Hartwicks of Charleston, had once been prominent in South Carolina society, but their prominence had been significantly diminished by the Civil War. They needed money. Thomas needed a wife young enough to bear children. It was, by the standards of that era, a practical arrangement entered into by both parties with clear-eyed recognition of what was being exchanged. Social status and financial security on Eleanor's side, the promise of heirs on Thomas's side. What was not practical, and what made Eleanor's story so exceptional and so threatening to the social order that had produced her, was what happened in the years immediately following the marriage. The plantation's internal records, preserved by chance after a courthouse fire in 1923, and maintained in a judge's personal collection until they were discovered by construction workers in 2019, showed something that the official county records carefully concealed. Eleanor was pregnant almost continuously between 1870 and 1889. 20 years of pregnancies documented in the meticulous plantation ledgers maintained by the overseers. 20 years of births recorded in careful handwriting with dates and notations about the children's health, their assignment to work duties, their distribution to various locations. But here was the problem for Thomas and for the county's elite, a problem that required systematic institutional response to manage. The children born to Eleanor did not look like Thomas Wright's children. They could not have. This was a biological impossibility that everyone understood, but no one could acknowledge. The children's mixed heritage, visible in their features, their skin tones, their hair texture, created a crisis of legitimacy and paternity that threatened the entire social order. How could Thomas acknowledge children whose very appearance suggested that Eleanor had borne offspring with someone outside her marriage? How could the society that had placed Eleanor in Thomas's bed as a young girl of 16 maintain its internal coherence if it also had to acknowledge the reality of her body and what that body had produced? The solution that Thomas and the county's legal and social institutions developed was devastatingly simple, yet brilliant in its systematic nature. First, the births would be recorded, but would be recorded in ledgers marked household staff or plantation labor, ledgers that used different notation systems, different organizational principles than the ledgers that recorded the births and deaths of white family members. Second, the children would be assigned new surnames, variations on common names used by enslaved families, surnames that bore no relationship to Thomas Wright or Eleanor Hartwick. Third, Eleanor herself would be listed in official records as without issue, as barren, as a woman who had never successfully carried a pregnancy to term. The pregnancy marks on Eleanor's body, the visible evidence of her repeated pregnancies and births, the testimony of enslaved midwives who had delivered the children, the memories of neighboring plantation families who had observed Eleanor's changing body, and the subsequent disappearance of infants from the main house. All of these were quietly suppressed through a combination of social pressure, institutional silence, strategic destruction of documents, and the careful cultivation of an alternative narrative. The narrative that emerged, repeated consistently in county historical records, plantation correspondence, and the private journals of the era's elite, was that Eleanor was a tragic figure, a woman whose body had proven incapable of fulfilling her primary function as a wife and bearer of heirs. But the photograph existed. Someone, perhaps Eleanor herself or a sympathetic photographer, or possibly even Thomas himself in a moment of hubris, had arranged for that portrait to be taken. Perhaps it was an act of defiance, an attempt to create evidence that would survive the erasure. Perhaps it was meant as testimony for a future that might finally listen. Perhaps it was Eleanor's way of asserting that the children existed, that they were real, that no amount of institutional silence could make them disappear from the visual record. The photograph was hidden, passed down through oral history among the descendants of the enslaved families who worked the Wright plantation, survivors who remembered the children, who remembered Eleanor's face, who never forgot that the official records had lied about what they themselves had witnessed. The photograph was hidden, passed down as an artifact of resistance, kept safe through decades of silence, waiting for a moment when someone might finally be willing to examine it closely and ask the questions that institutional power had spent 150 years trying to prevent. By the time Margaret found the portrait in 2023, almost everyone who might have directly explained its existence was dead. The photographer himself had died in 1912. Eleanor had been dead for 134 years. Thomas Wright had died in 1901. The enslaved people who had witnessed the births and the subsequent dispersal of the children had been dead for generations. But the photograph itself had survived, an object that refused to be erased, waiting in an archive that had catalogued it incorrectly for nearly 40 years, misfiled under generic headings, invisible to researchers unless they stumbled upon it by chance or deliberately searched for evidence of the institutional lie. What Margaret understood as she began her investigation was that erasure in this context was not accidental. It was not the result of poor record-keeping or the natural degradation of historical documentation over time. It was deliberate. It was systematic. It was maintained through the coordinated action of institutions, the county courthouse, the historical society, the churches, the social networks of the elite, the legal system itself. Each institution had played its part in maintaining the silence. The courthouse had destroyed or hidden documents. The Historical Society had misfiled or failed to investigate suspicious materials. The churches had recorded Eleanor as barren. The legal system had refused to acknowledge the children's existence. The social networks had enforced the narrative through gossip, through the power of collective agreement that certain truths simply could not be spoken. This was how erasure worked. Not through violence alone, though violence had certainly been part of it, but through the patient, systematic refusal to acknowledge what everyone knew to be true. Through the creation of alternative narratives so compelling and so consistently reinforced that they eventually became accepted as historical fact. Through the institutionalization of silence at every level of society. Chapter 3. The Children Without Names. One of the first and most significant obstacles Margaret encountered in her investigation was the simple yet devastating fact that the 12 children in the photograph had been deliberately obscured from the historical record in ways that made them extraordinarily difficult to trace. They had been given different surnames. They had been separated from one another. They had been distributed to different locations, some remaining on the Wright plantation as enslaved laborers, some sent to neighboring plantations, some placed in orphanages or apprenticeships in distant towns. To trace them, Margaret would need to work backward from fragmentary sources, oral histories recorded by descendants, scattered mentions in court documents, records from schools and orphanages where some of the older children had been sent, census records that sometimes captured fleeting glimpses of their existence, migration documents that showed movement between states and regions. The process was painstaking and frequently heartbreaking. Margaret spent months in various county courthouses and archives, photographing ledgers, cross-referencing names, building spreadsheets that attempted to connect fragmentary pieces of evidence into coherent narratives. She interviewed descendants of enslaved families who had worked on the Wright plantation, many of whom carried oral histories passed down through generations. She contacted genealogy databases and DNA ancestry companies, seeking descendants who might unknowingly carry the genetic legacy of Eleanor's children. The eldest boy in the photograph, standing in the back row with his hand resting protectively on the shoulders of the younger children in a gesture of profound responsibility that seemed almost to embody the weight of their collective erasure, was referred to in plantation gossip and in fragmentary archival references as the Wright boy, though not truly Wright, or simply the oldest. Court records from 1889 showed that he had been apprenticed to a blacksmith in a neighboring county under the name James Carroll. The apprenticeship documents were sparse, just a formal agreement dated March 1889, signed by Thomas Wright as guardian and countersigned by a blacksmith named Samuel Merriweather in a town approximately 30 miles south of the Wright plantation. The apprenticeship term was listed as 5 years, which would have made the boy approximately 14 years old at the time. Margaret found subsequent documentation of James Carroll in census records from 1890, which listed him as a mulatto, age 15, apprentice blacksmith, residing in household of Samuel Merriweather. The description mulatto was the official terminology of the era, a racial classification that acknowledged mixed heritage. A freedman's document from 1891 showed him formally registering in Atlanta as a free person of color, giving his occupation as blacksmith and listing his age as 17. After 1891, his trail through the historical record became more difficult to follow, fragmenting into the anonymity of a growing city, but Margaret eventually located death records indicating that James Carroll had lived until 1934, had worked as a blacksmith in Atlanta for more than 40 years, and had never married. The second child, a girl whose features in the photograph bore an unmistakable resemblance to Eleanor, the same jawline, the same distinctive nose, the same arrangement of features, had been sent away when she was approximately 13 years old. Margaret found a reference to her in the records of an orphanage in South Carolina, St. Catherine's Home for Colored Children, located in Charleston. The orphanage's admission records, preserved in a climate-controlled archive maintained by a religious organization, listed her as colored child, age 13, parentage unknown, admitted June 1883. She was identified in the records only as E.C., the initials burned with significance to Margaret. E for Eleanor, perhaps, C for something the record keepers would not preserve, would not acknowledge, would not inscribe into the official record. The orphanage records indicated that E.C. had remained at St. Catherine's for approximately 4 years, until 1887, at which point she had left the institution. The notation in the records was brief and uninformative. E.C. departed institution, subsequent location unknown. But Margaret's genealogical research eventually revealed what happened next. E.C. had migrated to North Carolina, where she appeared in census records beginning in 1890 as a school teacher at a freedmen's school in Raleigh. She was listed as unmarried, age 20, occupation teacher. The same woman appeared in subsequent census records through 1930, consistently listed as a teacher, progressively advancing in her career, her age increasing appropriately with each census cycle. Margaret spent months cross-referencing census records, church baptisms, prison records, and migration documents, building what she called probability maps, documents that attempted to establish reasonable confidence that a particular historical reference pointed to a particular child from the photograph. What emerged from this work was a pattern of dispersal so systematic that it seemed almost deliberate. as though someone had made a conscious decision to scatter the children to the four corners of the country, to ensure that they could never gather, never corroborate one another's stories, never collectively assert their shared identity. As the children grew old enough to pose the fundamental question of their status, were they enslaved? Were they free? Were they something that the society had no legal or social category for? They were systematically separated and sent to institutions or apprenticeships far from the plantation. The older children, born in the early 1870s, when slavery technically still existed, were distributed to various plantations or placed in apprenticeships. The younger children, born in the late 1880s, after Reconstruction had officially ended slavery, were more successfully absorbed into orphanages and the emerging foster systems that were beginning to develop in the region. By the time Margaret had identified 8 of the 12 children with reasonable confidence through her research, she realized something that made her blood run cold with a kind of professional horror. Not one of them had ever married. Not one had established a family line that survived into the 20th century. Not one had produced descendants who might carry forward their story, their genetic legacy, their connection to Eleanor. It was as though the children's existence, their reproductive capacity, their ability to create future generations bearing testimony to their own existence, had been treated as an anomaly to be contained and then systematically prevented. This was not natural attrition. This was not the random misfortune that befalls some individuals across generations. This was a pattern. This was evidence of something more systematic, more deliberate. And it pointed to a terrible possibility that the institutional erasure of these children had extended not merely to documentary records, but to their very ability to reproduce, to survive as a family line, to pass down to future generations the knowledge of who they were and where they came from. Now, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're listening to this from and the exact time you're hearing this story. I want to know how far these silenced narratives reach. Chapter 4. Eleanor's Silence. To understand what Eleanor endured during her 20 years on the Wright plantation, Margaret had to search through the fragmentary remnants of Eleanor's inner life, something that institutional records, by their very nature and by deliberate design, were constructed to conceal and suppress. Historical documentation typically records the external facts of a woman's existence: birth dates, marriage certificates, property transfers, death notices. But the inner landscape of a woman's consciousness, her emotional experience, her moral struggles, her private moments of despair or defiance, these leave almost no trace in official records. Yet Eleanor had left traces. Hidden in a private collection donated to the university in 1987, Margaret discovered something remarkable: a series of letters, never published, never formally catalogued, never properly investigated by previous historians. These were letters written in Eleanor's own hand, addressed to her younger sister Catherine in Charleston, written consistently over a span of nearly 2 decades between 1870 and 1888. The letters had been confiscated after Eleanor's death and stored in a sealed box, labeled in faded ink with the phrase, "Private family matters, not for public review." They had been maintained in a private collection for more than a century, passed down through descendants of Eleanor's sister Catherine, kept safe but hidden, treated as family secrets rather than as historical documents. When the collection was eventually donated to the university, the letters had been processed without particular attention to their content. A graduate student had organized them chronologically, created a basic index, and then the collection had been shelved, waiting for a researcher with the interest and the questions necessary to unlock their meaning. Margaret approached Eleanor's letters with a kind of reverence that was unusual in her scholarly practice. She photographed each letter carefully, created high-resolution digital copies, and then began to read them slowly, repeatedly, allowing Eleanor's voice to emerge from the page across 153 years of silence. What the letters revealed was a woman trapped in a nightmare that she herself seemed to understand was partly of her own making, bound by a silence enforced through a complex combination of love, terror, social pressure, legal powerlessness, and complicity in her own erasure. Eleanor's first letter, written in the spring of 1870, just months after her marriage to Thomas, was remarkably hopeful. She described her new home with something approaching wonder. She wrote about the beauty of the Georgia landscape, about the grandeur of the main house, about her optimistic imaginings of the future she would build with Thomas. She expressed gratitude for the marriage, for the security it provided her family, for the escape it offered from the reduced circumstances of her parents' household in Charleston. The voice in these early letters was that of a young woman, only 16 years old at the time of writing, attempting to convince herself and her sister that her marriage was indeed what she had been raised to believe it was: a triumph, a success, a fulfillment of her proper destiny. But by the second letter, written approximately 1 year later in the spring of 1871, a fundamental shift in tone had occurred. Eleanor was pregnant. She wrote about this pregnancy with ambivalence that bordered on dread. Thomas was pleased, she wrote, more pleased than she had ever seen him. But then Eleanor wrote something that made Margaret pause and read the passage multiple times before its meaning became fully clear. "I have been informed that the child I carry shall not be spoken of as mine own, but as a gift to the household. I have agreed to this arrangement, though my heart breaks with each word I do not speak." The phrase "gift to the household" appeared frequently in subsequent letters, repeated like an incantation, like something Eleanor was trying to force herself to believe. Margaret understood, reading this language, that Thomas had constructed a narrative to manage the impossible situation that Eleanor's pregnancy had created. If the child were to be born, obviously not of Thomas's fathering, and the inevitable appearance of the child would make this abundantly clear, then the child could not belong to Eleanor either. Instead, the child would belong to the household itself, to the plantation, to be raised among the enslaved population or distributed as Thomas saw fit. The subsequent letters became increasingly fragmented, almost coded, as though Eleanor was learning to write in a language designed to conceal, even from herself, what she was experiencing. She wrote about the children I am not permitted to name. She wrote about the silence that grows heavier with each passing year, about the weight of words unsaid. She wrote about the price of protection, though it was never entirely clear what protection she meant. Protection from what? From whom? From social ruin, from legal consequences, from her own despair. In one letter from 1875, Eleanor wrote that Thomas had explained to her that acknowledging the children as her own would destroy her reputation irreparably. It would make her complicit in some unspoken crime, some violation of the social order that could not be articulated but which everyone understood. That it was better, kinder, that the children be raised among the enslaved population where they would at least be cared for by people who could love them freely. That the alternative, public acknowledgement of her children would result in social ostracism so complete that she would be left with nothing, not even her marriage, not even her place in society. Eleanor had accepted this lie, or perhaps it would be more accurate to say she had been given no choice but to accept it. The letters reveal a woman fragmenting under the weight of enforced denial, a woman who loved children she could not claim, who watched them grow up in a world that treated them as less than human, while forcing her to participate in the pretense that they did not exist. There are passages in the letters that suggest Eleanor attempted to maintain some kind of relationship with the children in secret, references to moments in which she could hold a newborn without being observed, Opportunities to speak a child's true name when she was alone with them. Attempts to teach them something of their own history before they were taken away. One letter, written in 1887, when Eleanor was in her mid-50s and had not given birth for approximately 7 years, contained a single sentence that Margaret found underlined multiple times in Eleanor's hand, as though the act of writing and underlining this phrase repeatedly was itself a kind of assertion, a kind of resistance to the erasure. When I am gone, they will remember me as barren, but God knows the truth of what I have borne. Eleanor died in 1889 at age 53, just 2 years after writing those words. The official cause of death listed in the county records was heart failure. Margaret found the death certificate in the courthouse records, photographed it, examined it carefully. There was nothing remarkable about it, nothing to suggest foul play or anything other than natural causes. Nothing to indicate that a woman had spent nearly 20 years carrying an impossible secret, that she had given birth to 12 children she was not permitted to acknowledge, that she had loved them in silence, that she had carried to her grave the knowledge of her own complicity in her own erasure. Chapter 5. The Buried Evidence. By 2019, Margaret had assembled a substantial historical record that, while compelling and internally coherent, would not have been considered definitive proof by the rigorous standards of academic historical scholarship. Letters could be forged or could be misinterpreted through the lens of modern assumptions. Oral histories, while valuable, were notoriously subject to distortion, misremembering, the introduction of false details across generations of retelling. Photographs could be misidentified or their significance overinterpreted. Census records and other institutional documents often contained errors or ambiguities. Academic historians had been trained to be deeply skeptical of exactly this kind of evidence. Fragmentary, circumstantial, open to multiple interpretations. Margaret knew that what she had accumulated, while it amounted to a convincing narrative, might be dismissed by skeptical scholars as speculative, as an example of confirmation bias, as a researcher who had become emotionally invested in a particular interpretation of ambiguous evidence. She needed something harder. She needed documentary evidence that could not be explained away or dismissed as speculation or misinterpretation. She needed what historians call smoking gun evidence, direct, unambiguous, contemporary documentation that could only be read one way. That evidence arrived through a completely unexpected avenue in 2019. A construction crew undertaking renovation work on the county courthouse discovered a series of cardboard boxes in a basement storage room that had been sealed since the 1950s and forgotten by everyone. The boxes contained original court documents from the 1880s and 1890s, records that had never been digitized, that had never been organized into the systematic filing systems that later generations had developed, that few people even knew existed. Among those documents, in a box labeled simply Wright Family Litigation, was a petition filed by Thomas Wright in 1888, addressed to the county court, requesting legal clarification on the status of certain individuals born on his property. The petition was remarkable for what it revealed about Thomas's anxiety regarding the children. He wrote about the legal ambiguity they represented. He expressed concern about inheritance claims that might be brought against his estate after his death. He articulated worry about the implications of their mixed status in a state with increasingly complex racial codes being developed in response to the end of slavery. He asked for a formal ruling that would definitively establish that these individuals had no claim on his estate, no legal connection to his family name, no right to inherit any portion of the substantial wealth he had accumulated. The language in the petition was remarkable for its explicitness. Thomas actually named several of the children by their adopted surnames: James Carroll, Margaret Davis, Robert Johnson. He described them as individuals born on my plantation to women in my employ. He requested that the court provide a definitive legal statement regarding the status of such individuals and clarification that no claims of paternity or filial relationship should be recognized or acted upon. The court's response was equally revealing and in many ways more disturbing. Rather than issuing a formal ruling that would settle the legal question through due process, rather than creating a precedent that could guide future similar cases, the judge, a man named William Hutchins, who had extensive business dealings with the Wright family, had simply returned the petition with a handwritten note. The note read, "These matters are best left to private family discretion. No official record need be made. Judge Hutchins." It was an extraordinary example of institutional complicity. A judge, faced with a legal question that should have been settled through proper judicial procedure, instead chose silence. The matters were left to private discretion, which effectively meant they were left to erasure. No ruling meant no precedent. No precedent meant no obligation for other families to acknowledge similar situations. No legal requirement meant that the silence could be maintained indefinitely. But there was more. In those same sealed boxes, Margaret discovered medical records from a doctor who had served the Wright plantation in the 1880s. These records contained clinical notes about pregnancies, births, treatments, and what appeared to be notes regarding fertility interventions or reproductive management. The doctor's records, written in the clinical language of that era, contained disturbing references to managed reproduction, to controlled breeding, to children whose births had been orchestrated rather than left to chance. One particular note, dated 1876 and written in the doctor's careful medical hand, stated, "Female patient Eleanor has successfully carried to term as per design. Male issue produced. Patient remains in stable condition for subsequent pregnancies as previously arranged. TW expresses satisfaction with current arrangement. Recommend continued management of female's reproductive capacity according to established protocol." The phrase, "according to established protocol," suggested that what was happening to Eleanor was not unique, was not an improvisation, but rather part of a deliberate system. A protocol implied planning, intention, previous experience. It suggested that Thomas Wright and the doctor had developed a systematic approach to managing Eleanor's reproductive capacity, to producing children who bore his genetic material without carrying his name, to maintaining both the production of these children and the complete erasure of Eleanor as their mother. Margaret photographed every document. She made copies for her personal files. She felt, as she examined these records, a kind of cold rage. Not the hot, immediate rage of someone witnessing a fresh injustice, but the deeper, more corrosive rage of someone understanding that systematic cruelty had been embedded into institutions, had been normalized and systematized, and passed down across generations with such efficiency that it had become almost invisible. These records made explicit what Eleanor's letters had hinted at and what the oral histories had suggested. The children had not been born from consensual relationships. They were the product of a deliberate program imposed on Eleanor with the cooperation of medical professionals and sanctioned by the legal system. Eleanor had been treated as a kind of reproductive vessel, her body colonized by Thomas Wright and the institutions that served his interests. She had been forced to bear children she could not acknowledge in service to the legal fiction that she was barren.